Hey everyone, Brenda here from Survival Crafts. Well, as promised, today is the day I'm going to be making the video on how to do an oil infusion. Now in the last video I kept forgetting to also add in that I'm going to be doing a couple of other things with this oil infusion. And that is, I'm going to be making part of it into a salve, and part of it I'm going to reserve for the next video after this, which will be on soap making. In a moment, we're going to have a look at some of the materials and equipment that we'll be using, and I want to give you a little bit of information on some of the equipment and what to do if you don't have that specific equipment. So I also want to say one other thing. I don't have the plantain. I thought I did, so I'm going to be making a Comfrey Salve. I would really like to encourage everybody that's watching this, if you don't have a lot of background in using plants and using herbs and whatnot on a medicine basis, well, please research things very thoroughly and very carefully. Big hint, Facebook is not the place to do that. As well-meaning as many people are, there's a ton of misinformation out there. And I don't need to explain that to you. I'm sure everybody there is smart enough to understand that. Some of the information, as convincing as it may sound, it's really not accurate information. For example, plantain that I was going to be using, the memes that are out there about plantain are just ridiculous. So there are claims that are being made about it that the plant just doesn't do. Now, for me, plantain really is almost a miracle plant, and I really feel that it is underplayed with the value that it actually contains in terms of a food and a medicine. And people regale it as the bug bite solution, which it's great for wasp stings and bee stings and mosquitoes and that sort of thing. It's fantastic for that. But it has a huge power and shining glory in many other areas. So really look at getting some good education behind that so you can understand the plant in a better way. And I would say that find somebody who's really reputable. In the description box down below, I'm going to be putting some links to some fantastic friends, Robert Dale Rogers and his wife, Lori Zott Rogers. They've got some wonderful courses coming up, and this video is very timely for those of you who are looking to get onto a herbal course here in Alberta. Both Robert and Lori are just exceptional when it comes to instructional stuff, so please make sure that you check them out. If you don't have an opportunity to check out Robert and Lori or even do a course with them because you're not anywhere near the area, Robert has written, I honestly have lost count after 48, I think, books that he's written. And his books are extremely well written. He is a very good researcher and has enormous amounts of information on many of the plants here in the boreal forest. So if you can't make it to one of his courses, I'd highly recommend buying one of his books. There are many other people all throughout the United States and Canada where you can check into their courses, their herbal schools and whatnot. So please educate yourself in the correct way. Educate yourself with really good people that have a good background. And I'm not saying don't look on Facebook, and I'm not saying don't check out the internet, but check, double check, and recheck your sources. And one final thing I'll say on my little rant is that if you're going to be looking at plant medicine, even some of the most renowned experts, they'll tell you great stuff about a plant. Regardless of what you're told, what you learn, test it out for yourself. Make sure that you're happy with what is being said is actually true for you. We're all different. We're all snowflakes. Plants affect us all in different ways. So do your own research. I really encourage you to do that. Okay, so that's my rant over. Let's go have a look at the comfrey, as well as the materials and other ingredients we're going to be working with. Okay, let's take a look at some of the things we'll need. So I've got some comfrey there. This is stuff that I hung up and I dried last year. And so that's going to be necessary. To help turn it into a salve, we need some olive oil. Let me just back off a little bit here. Other sort of ingredients we're going to need is some beeswax. Now, let me open that up. this is a little awkward for me because I have to sort of be behind the camera at the same time, so don't mind me. Okay, so we've got some beeswax there. It's just kind of made into chunks here, and what I did was I actually bought this from a beekeeper, and of course it came in one big solid lump. And all I did to break this down, because if you've ever tried to break a chunk off of a big solid massive piece of a kilogram of beeswax, not fun and not easy. So I used a hammer and chisel to break it up as much as I could into smaller chunks, and then I put it onto wax paper on a cookie sheet in the lowest possible setting on my oven until it all melted, and then it all spread thin. And then I brought it out of the oven, and then I let it completely cool, and then I just broke it up into little chunks like this. So other handy pieces of equipment then, we'll put the beeswax aside for now, is a digital scale to also figure out how much beeswax you're going to need to put in to the final product. You're definitely going to need to, I just use masking tape and a Sharpie to put my labels on, because you definitely want to label it. I guarantee you will forget what you've made. And then the final piece of equipment is this. Now, I'm doing this all indoors, and yes, this is something you can do outdoors, but let's talk a little bit about something more specific. I don't know if you can see this very well or not, but I've got sort of a little miniature crock pot. I think I bought this at Walmart for 11 bucks. I think they've gone way up to 13 now, but still a pretty good bargain. And I've got 4 of these actually, and I make a lot of different medicines with these little guys here. So they're very, very handy to have. But what's important about this, and it's the reason why I left it to the last, is it's got 4 settings on it. And again, I'm not really sure how well you can read that. It's hard for me to see through my little viewfinder, but I'll try to lift that up a little bit, and maybe the glare is too much. But we've got off, low, high, and warm. Now, when you are working with plant material, especially the aerial parts, the setting that you want is warm. So it's a good idea, if you don't already have a crock pot, is to get one of these. One of the reasons why you want to have one with warm is because it won't overheat your plant material. Low absolutely will, and you can even get that to start boiling or simmering, and you don't want that. You do not want to do that. You will kill the medicine. So a warm setting is very, very important. And if you don't have that and all you've got are the off, low, and high, you can put it on low, but watch it like a hawk. You can plug it in for 20 minutes and then unplug it for a few minutes, say 10-15 minutes, and plug it back in. Inconvenient, but it will make sure that your medicine does not get destroyed by too much heat. Can you do this over a campfire? Absolutely you can. What I would recommend, though, is you just kind of take the ashes from your campfire, and I might do this actually on another video, but if you're using a little tin can or whatever, you can take that, the oil or the fat or whatever you're going to do, and put your plant material in, and we'll get onto that in just a moment. But you could then take the hot coals from the fire and make a little perimeter of hot coals around your can, and space them fairly far away from the can, like probably at least 5 centimeters as a ring, and that could even be too hot. Because if you try to put it on your fire or even on the coals there, it's going to boil, and it will boil really quickly. Not only will that destroy the medicine, but your oil can go more rancid a little bit more quickly. Can you do this with deer tallow, lard? You bet you can. You might end up using a little bit less beeswax, but you can play around with that. And I'm going to show you how you can test to see if your salve has the right amount of beeswax or not. Okay, so let's get busy with this. So what I need now is also a chopstick. I love using chopsticks for my mixtures. So I got that little jar that was pretty full of comfrey. And you know what? When I'm doing oil infusions, I do not ever measure them. I really am not bothered. I know I can get a pretty good quality. So I'm going to take my oil and just start dumping. I like to cover my plants. I don't want it to be super liquidy, but I don't want it to be super dry either. So I'm probably going to add, I think I'll just dump the rest of that in, and that'll be probably fine. So that was probably close to about maybe 75 grams, 70 grams of comfrey, roughly, just estimating. I didn't weigh it on my scale because I have to grab a new battery in it, and I haven't done that yet. So I don't know, around 70-ish grams, and then maybe 250 mils, 300 mils of oil. And don't get too freaked out about how much and how little and all that other kind of stuff. Now, the crock pot comes with a lid. And I am not going to use the lid, and I'll explain why. But let me just turn this on to my warm setting. I'll push that back a little bit, and now I can let it cook. I just leave the chopstick in there. I don't bother taking that out. That can just sit in there. All right, so let's talk about this a little bit. So the measurements, I'm not too concerned. I never find that any of the salves that I make have any problems with them, but a few things. The comfrey that I put in was dried comfrey, and I'm not putting the lid on. One of the reasons is this: if I put the lid on, I may possibly create some steam. If I create steam, then that can go down into the oil, and we have oil in, or water in the oil, even in small amounts. If that happens, then I need to put a preservative in, because the water create a faster possibility of this to go bad, to go moldy, and to go rancid. So you want to avoid water in it as much as you possibly can. So that comes on to one of the reasons why I use dry herbs. Now, do I use dry herbs every time? No, I do not. You will find people will say you can only use dry herbs to make your oil infusion, or only ever use fresh herbs. Well, those are just sort of rules of thumb, and I think it's personal preference. For me, the plants that I can use quite happily that are dry, then I will use those. And it's a little bit of a safety catch for me. So I will use those and to prevent any mold and spoilage and that sort of thing. However, there are certain plants where they are much superior and much better when they're fresh. And in fact, certain plants, if you do dry them, some of their medicinal qualities actually disappear and they don't come back when you reconstitute them. So certain plants, it is best to use them when they're fresh. So really the fresh and versus dry question is a matter of personal preference, and then it also will depend on the plant itself. So how long do we want to let it sit in here for? Now, you will get all kinds of different answers, and again, it's just a matter of the personal preference. You'll hear answers anywhere from after 2 hours you're good to go, or after 4 hours you're good to go, whatever. And some people will say you can make this go on for days and days and days and days. And again, for me, that it's personal preference. Sometimes when I'm teaching classes, I don't have the luxury of time. So often our oil infusions go on for approximately 4 hours. But sometimes, depending on the strength of the medicine I want to get, for example, when I work with poplar buds and I want to make a salve out of those, quite often I will let that go for several days because I want something specific to happen out of that. So it really depends. And there's nothing wrong with even this one that we're making now. If I wanted to let it go for several days, not a big deal. During the night, I unplug it and then let it cool down. The next morning, I'll plug it back in again. I don't really like leaving electronic items on all night, so usually I'll just unplug it, and I can do it for several days. Now, this guy, we're simply going to leave it for 4 or 5 hours, and then we'll come back and strain it off, and that should be good enough for this one. Okay, I think that's all I need to tell you. Just remember, if you should be keeping an eye on this, even though it's on warm. We really want to watch it. We definitely don't want it to boil, and that's about it. We'll see you later. Okay, well, here we are on the next day. Well, we're ready to go. Here's our oil, and it's nice and dark in comparison to what it actually was. So what do I need now? I want a clean, dry jar. I'm going to have to label that. So our oil, a jar, labeling stuff. We'll need our crock pot again. Beeswax is going to be the next thing on the item. Next item on the list. And finally, we need our little scale here. And I still like to use my chopstick in this. So I'm going to strain this out. I've got my, last night I finished this off and I just poured my herbs into the stocking. I've hung it suspended above the solution. You've seen me do this on the other video. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my little jar on the scale. I will turn it on to zero it out. And I'm going to pour some oil in. Now, before I do that, I just want to explain a couple of things. So, first of all, as I mentioned, the beeswax that I'm using here came from a beekeeper, so it's really good stuff, and it smells amazing. It's got a real honey smell to it. You can buy pellets that are cut into tiny little pieces so they melt down a little bit quicker. That's just fine. It's up to you. I prefer to use these, the fresh beeswax. I just think there's a few more medicinal properties to it. Now, the ratio for beeswax to oil, it all depends on what you're trying to do. If you are trying to create a soft salve, you use less beeswax. If you're trying to create a harder salve, you use more beeswax. Once we have our stuff all melted together, what I'm going to do is show you how do we test that to determine is this soft enough, hard enough, and how to fix that. All right, so we're at zero right now, and I'm going to pour some oil in. Beautiful green color. And I'm going to pour in about, say 50, if I can get there. All right, 51, no biggie. Now what I want to do is I'll zero that out again. Of course, I can leave it on, and now I have to determine how much beeswax I want to put in here. I can do a 1-to-1, so I've got the 50 mils of oil, and I could put in 50 grams of beeswax. That would give me a pretty crazy hard salve, which some people might like. I can put in a 1 part beeswax, 2 part oil, or 1 part beeswax, 3 parts oil.
So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in about 15 grams of my beeswax. So I've got 12. Then that'll probably do right there. So I'm going to test that once it's all melted out, and we'll see how that works for me. So I'm just going to get rid of my oil. I'll move these out of the way. So I've got my beeswax in my oil ready to go. Now there's a couple of ways that I have melted this down in the past. And that is, I can put the inner part back in and put some boiling water, filling up to about there and letting it melt out. Or I can put this directly into the heat source, and then I'll put it on a low heat. So all I want to do is get that stuff melted out. And that's the method I'm going to use. So let's get that going. And if I'm out of frame, it's because I can't really see right now, but I'll move it back into frame. I just want to get that plugged in. Ah, not a bad job, I guess. Okay, so let's move in a little closer. And what I tend to do, as you can see, this is really well loved. I'm going to turn my crock pot on to low. Sometimes I'll put it on high if I got a really large jar. And I'm going to just put that inside there. I'm going to check it periodically and stir it periodically. I'm going to just leave my chopstick right in there. It doesn't have to come out. And I'll come back partially through the melting process, and then again once it's completely melted. Okay, so we're starting to get that melt action going, and in fact, quite a bit of it's melted. So that's what it looks like so far. I will let that finish melting out, and I'll bring you back. Okay, we are all nicely melted out here. I'm gonna pick up my little jar with a cloth because I don't want to burn myself. It's very hot. And stick it on the lid there. And that's it. This now is going to solidify, and I'm going to remove my chopstick. So the chopstick itself is one way that you can determine whether your salve is soft enough or not. And I do that by just letting it drip off a little bit here. And then I'll set it to the side, and I'll show you in a bit. But the other thing is, I just have to run to my freezer and pull out a spoon that I've had in there. And you don't need to do this. So I'm just going to put my spoon in there and let it come out. And of course it's going to solidify pretty quickly. Now lots of people will go and put the spoon back in the freezer again. You don't have to. At this point in time now, you're going to have a pretty good idea of whether your salve is the right consistency or not. And I'm going to take that off. And that is pretty much what I want in my salve. It's soft enough. So I think this is going to work out perfectly. I'm going to let that solidify, and I will bring you back as soon as that's done. One thing I want to mention before I forget is that you'll notice I'm leaving the lid off of this. When we infused our oil, we left the lid off the crock pot while we're cooling the salve, and also while I cooled the oil, I left the lid off. So I allowed it to cool off before I put the lid onto the oil jar, and this one I will allow this to cool off before I put the lid back on here. That's very important. I don't want any of the heat to produce steam and then us to have a little bit of water droplet in our oil, because as I said earlier, that's a good way to introduce bacteria. All right, we'll see you as soon as this is solid. So that's it. That is that's our salve. Comfrey Salve. By the way, I did label my jar, and of course I have created a label for my salve. Really important that you do that. Nice and cool now, so I can put the lid on. And that's it. Pretty easy to do. All right, well, I'm gonna go pop that into my first aid kit, and that's it. Pretty easy.
Well, I hope you found that video informative and enjoyable. It was pretty cool to make. And as you can probably see, it's pretty easy to make a salve. Sometimes it's just a little bit of a time factor, but it's worthwhile putting that extra time in just to make a really good quality salve. So the next video coming up, I'm going to be using now some of that comfrey oil to be making some soap. And that will be the first part of our soap series. Now I really need to take you through the basics of soap before I actually start working on the land and creating lye and all that other kind of stuff. So we have to go through some basics of soap making before I do the soap making off the land. So bear with me on that one, and I'm not sure how many series are going to come out of it, but there will be a few. All right, well, I guess we'll see you on the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.